Light, Legacy, and Law, the Marriage of the Prophet ﷺ and Aisha. Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're diving into the deep historical and sociological context of what is, without a doubt, one of the most widely discussed marriages in human history. So let's just jump right in.
How do we measure the maturity of the past using the yardsticks of the present? Well, before we can truly analyze historical events, we've got to zoom way out. We really have to strip away our 21st century assumptions to understand the harsh demographic realities of the ancient world. It's so easy to look back 1,000 years and judge a society by modern standards, right? But doing that, it completely blinds us to the actual mechanics of how human beings survived, adapted, and organized their communities back then.
This core demographic divide tells us almost everything we need to know. According to our historical sources, for the vast majority of human history, humanity was stuck in this intense agrarian survival mode. Because of incredibly high infant mortality, survival meant producing a lot of children and hitting adulthood as quickly as physically possible. Fast forward to today, our modern demographic transition, thanks to modern medicine and lower mortality, lets us significantly delay when societal adulthood actually begins. But in the ancient world, across literally all cultures, biology dictated maturity out of sheer necessity.
Now, when Islamic law or Sharia was introduced to these ancient Arabian societies, it didn't just drop in like a blunt instrument trying to magically erase all human norms overnight. Actually, the sources show us it was an incredibly adaptable, gradual system. It tackled the massive existential issues first, like overturning idolatry. Then it moved on to deeply entrenched social habits, phasing out things like alcohol over time. And finally, it began this steady, progressive adaptation of marriage customs. It was about reshaping them slowly, rather than just breaking the society apart.
Which brings us to a society that is just pulsating with intellectual energy. To really get a feel for this, we aren't just going to look at dry dates and facts. We're stepping into a visionary aesthetic. Think of a neon-lit biopunk Medina, complete with an iconic neon green dome and silver palms. It's the perfect metaphor for a dynamic landscape that was rapidly shifting from ancient, survival-based traditions into a highly structured, visionary future. It was literally a crucible of new ideas, fresh legal frameworks, and unprecedented social mobility.
And here in this radiant setting, we meet the primary figures of our explainer. Following the descriptions in our historical sources, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is depicted conceptually as a steadfast pillar of light. This reflects the physical and spiritual illumination the sources say constantly surrounded him. Beside him is Aisha, represented as a brilliant, radiant light of intellect and purity. To respect the historical traditions, they are shown purely as intellectual and spiritual energy, entirely devoid of facial features, which really highlights their profound impact on human consciousness.
To understand the timing of their union, we have to look at a deeply foundational Islamic concept, fitra. The philosopher Ibn Taymiyyah described fitra as a sort of barzakh, an intermediary state. Basically, it means a human isn't just born as a blank slate, but they aren't born knowing everything either. Fitra is a structural disposition. It's an innate psychological readiness, an attunement you absolutely need to process universal truth and interact with the world around you.
So here's the crucial point. Watch how this concept of fitra started shifting societal paradigms. While those ancient agrarian societies we talked about were marrying almost exclusively based on physical, biological puberty, early Islam initiated a subtle but massive shift. It began distinguishing mere physical readiness from true psychological maturity. You know that emotional and intellectual readiness you actually need to take on the heavy responsibilities of a household and a community?
This critical distinction between biological puberty and psychological maturity explains a very specific structural detail in their timeline. There was a strict 3-year delay between the signing of Aisha's marriage contract and the actual consummation of the marriage. The contract was locked in, sure, but the transition to a shared life was intentionally paused.
So you might be wondering, why sign the contract then, if it wasn't going to be consummated for 3 whole years? Well, the sources point to a divine command meant to forge an unbreakable alliance during a time of extreme vulnerability. This 3-year delay completely coincided with the perilous hijrah. That's the migration of the early Muslims from intense persecution in Mecca to the safety of Medina. The contract secured an ironclad bond between the Prophet and his closest ally, Aisha's father, right in the middle of this incredibly dangerous transition.
And who exactly was that ally? Her father was Abu Bakr, a crazy successful businessman with wealth exceeding 40,000 dirhams, an absolute fortune at the time. But what's fascinating is how he used it. He didn't just fund the vulnerable early community and buy the freedom of persecuted people, he fiercely prioritized his children's education. He invested heavily in his daughter Aisha's intellect during a pre-Islamic era where some pagan tribes were literally burying their newborn daughters in the sand. Just let that contrast sink in.
Empowered by that kind of highly supportive environment, Aisha developed what I can only describe as an intellectual arsenal. The historical records here are just staggering. She memorized more than 12,000 verses of poetry. She became a leading historian, an astronomer, a scholar of herbal medicine, a faqiha, which is a master of Islamic jurisprudence, and a mufti, someone qualified to issue binding legal rulings. She literally became the most educated woman in the entire Arabian Peninsula.
And she didn't just hoard this knowledge, she institutionalized it. Aisha wasn't some passive student of the Prophet. She became the chief supervisor of education in Medina. We have entire historical compilations, like those by the scholar al-Zarkashi, dedicated solely to documenting times where Aisha fearlessly corrected, debated, and critiqued the legal opinions of senior male companions and scholars. She was the absolute intellectual authority of her time, no question.
Her influence definitely wasn't confined to the classroom either. It spilled over heavily into civic and political life. Remember, this was a newly structured society setting completely unprecedented legal frameworks. The sources reveal that in Medina, a legal voting age was established. Historians note it was set at either 15 or 18 years old. And this framework, it applied to the entire community.
We actually see the real-world application of that civic structure when Aisha famously cast her vote for Uthman to become the caliph. According to historical texts, this marks the first historically recorded democratic vote in human history that legally and systematically included women right alongside men. She wasn't just participating in this society, she was actively shaping who led it.
Her agency only grew stronger as the decades passed. Later in life, after the Caliph Uthman was assassinated, Aisha demanded justice. And she didn't just stay on the sidelines. She literally rode out into the field, put on iron armor, and became the sole commander of a massive military force moving into Iraq. She was directing an entire army from atop her camel in an event famously known as the Battle of the Camel.
The historical records describing her command are striking. One notes, she led the battle strategically and psychologically brilliantly, and her words from atop the camel ignited enthusiasm in the soldiers. Even when facing off against highly respected opponents, her tactical genius and commanding presence were just undeniable. It perfectly illustrates how she was never, ever a passive subject of her time. She was a deeply empowered architect of Islamic civilization, jurisprudence, and women's rights.
So as we zoom back out to where we started, we're left with a really profound question. If an allegedly primitive ancient society could nurture, protect, and ultimately be led by a woman of such staggering intellect and unprecedented agency, what does that reveal about the true nature of her history? It really challenges us to wonder how our rigid, modern assumptions might actually be obscuring the brilliantly complex and progressive realities of the past. That's all for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.